Hi everyone. I'm Shir from Columbia University, and the project that I'll be presenting here today is a joint project with Tamar Mitz, also from Columbia University. And it's a very much work in progress. Actually, we just finished data collection 3 weeks ago, so I'm very curious to hear your inputs. And it also heavily relies on insights and some of the follow-up questions that you just mentioned now from the project that Yotam just presented. But I would like to start with a wave of motivation for this specific project. So, as AI increasingly influence nearly every aspect of our lives, governments are grappling with the task or challenging task of regulating this powerful technology to ensure or to unlock its huge potential, but while ensuring it serves the public good and maintains human rights. And this is not an easy task. The technology is changing very rapidly. It has very diverse applications across different sectors, which requires a very flexible framework that can be also technically feasible to implement and to enforce in practice. And while there is much discussion about these legal and technical barriers to regulate AI, much less attention has been given to the political question, the political feasibility of implementing or pursuing these policy measures, and specifically the ability to mobilize broad support from diverse coalitions of voters and stakeholders. And this is particularly challenging in times of rising polarization, where partisan divides often overshadow some more substantive discussions in policy issues. So some of the questions that we are interested to address here is what do voters think about government stepping in to regulate AI, and to what extent public opinions on this matter is divided by partisan or ideological divided. And the little evidence that we've seen so far, as also some of them presented by the earlier presentations, suggests that there is no clear partisan endorsements or divide on most of the issues related to AI policies. Indeed, we see some recent bipartisan initial efforts to regulate AI, and which is quite consistent with the conclusion that, at least at this stage of the public debate, the AI is not yet politicized. But as Yotam already said, this could change over time, as we've seen in other emerging policy issues. So in the paper, we discussed the case of environmental regulation and the content moderation policies, which started as non-partisan issues, but over the time become highly politicized. So in this article, we explore the potential polarization in the debate over AI regulation by focusing specifically on the media as a key channel through which voters learn about emerging policy issues, and also a channel through which different stakeholders communicate their interests and stands to the public. So first, we analyzed US media coverage of recent advances in AI over the 10,000s of articles, news articles. We mapped the key stakeholders participated in the debate and the main issues they discussed. And then, using data from a pre-registered, well-powered survey experiment, we assessed the effectiveness of these media messages by various stakeholders in mobilizing public support for regulating AI. And due to time constraints, I'll be focusing today on the experimental study, but I'll be happy to elaborate more on the other parts of the article, and you can also find them in the paper. But before moving to the experiment, I just want to go over very briefly on our main argument. So in the paper, we propose a framework to think about the conditions under which the public debate over AI regulation would become politicized or polarized. So on the one hand, we argue that this largely depends on voters' ability and more importantly, motivations to engage with substantive information about AI's potential implications, risk or benefits. And so on the one hand, as Yotam just presented, and argue AI is an emerging policy issue. There is no clear partisan or elite partisan cues or endorsements to rely on. So voters might be more open to engage with substantive information and to process the evidence in less biased manners when considering or shaping their policy preferences. We see some evidence in this direction. But on the other hand, AI is also very technical and complex issue. Its impact on voters' lives or well-being may seem abstract, distant, or even speculative. And so their voters might dismiss information as irrelevant or maybe too demanding cognitively. And without this substantive engagement, that might base their opinions on the policy questions based on more broader predispositions or ideological beliefs, for example, about the government role or intervention in the market in general that has little to do with the specific questions of AI. And given these two competing dynamics, we suggest a third possibility, which is that voters may be selective or more selective in the way that they engage with information or new information about AI. And instead of forming opinions directly based on elite cues, they might use these cues, various cues from elites, to decide what information or which information deserves or worth their attention. But once they engage with this substantive information, they might process it in less biased manner. So to examine these three dynamics, we conducted an experiment in a US survey in which we randomly exposed respondents to different types of arguments about AI from different stakeholders. We based them from our insights from the first, the media text analysis. And specifically, we communicate the information indirectly. So we presented the survey as a survey about journalism, and we asked respondents to complete simple editorial tasks, and we embedded the information within these tasks. So respondents were asked to read paragraphs taken from news articles and to choose for each paragraph or for each news article an appropriate headline and subheading that capture the essence of the article. We then asked them in a follow-up task to place the different articles in the newspaper based on the public importance of the issue, for example, front page newspaper or last page. And 3 of the paragraphs they just asked to edit, we embedded within these 3 paragraphs the information about AI implications. We focused on 3 key areas based on our media text analysis. So AI in public decision-making, in public policy decision-making, automation in the labor market, and 1 paragraph about the consequences of using large language models. And we randomized 2 elements within these 3 paragraphs. So first, the type of the message or the type of the argument. So either negative or positive coverage on AI. So that highlight either the potential benefits of using AI or the risks. And the second manipulation was about the source of the message or the stakeholder provides the argument. So it could be either tech leaders, experts, or politicians, either Republicans or Democrats. And we also included pure control conditions that received paragraphs on unrelated issues, also about fashion industry, but some other. And we also, to blur the focus of the study on AI, we also included 2 additional paragraphs on unrelated issues. This is how the task was looked like. So I see that I don't have time, but we can discuss later about the substantive content that we provided within the paragraphs. So we then asked respondents a set of questions. Some of them were about AI regulation. Specifically, we used 3 key questions to measure our main outcome. 1 asked about support for strict regulation, even at the expense of innovation. A second question asked about the timing of regulating AI, whether it should be now or we should wait until the technology evolves. And the third question asked about the role of the government in implementing these regulations or rules. And finally, we also included some behavioral outcomes to assess information-seeking behavior. So we use them to assess, you will see in a moment, that we use them to assess whether voters use elite cues to form directly opinions or to infer about the credibility or the relevance of the information. So to this end, we designed and launched a weblog called Algorithm Stories, and that features several different content on AI and society. And the three most recent posted that presented on the website were the full articles that respondents just engaged with in the experiment. So we generated 9 different URL links for each treatment groups in our experiments. And at the very end of the survey, we invited, 5 minutes, okay. We invited all respondents to voluntarily enter the weblog, and then we tracked the engagement, the respondents' engagement in the blog based on their treatment group or the link. Okay, let's move very quickly to the results. So starting with a very basic question, what do voters think about government intervention in regulating AI? So I think that the figure, you see now the figure, in the figure, the levels of support among respondents that received the placebo, the pure control groups, that received information on unrelated issues. So overall, I think that the figure shows quite clearly that we see some high, I think, relatively high level of support for regulating AI, over than 55% in all of our questions. But we also observed some initial partisan divides on these questions, particularly regarding the question of the government's role in intervening in regulating AI. The next question is to what extent these views can shift as a response to new information. And again, consistent with the results that Yotam presented, we also find that overall exposure to information, specifically negative coverage on AI, can change. People are open to change their minds on these questions when receiving novel information about AI, specifically risks. But as I will show you in a moment, this openness is conditioned or dependent on the source of the information. So they are willing to engage with information, but in a very specific, maybe theoretical, predictable conditions, depending on the stakeholders that provide the information. No time for this? Okay, so now when we will look at the sample that received the negative coverage, and you can see here, so the results are based on a regression analysis that we regress all our treatment conditions and an indicator for partisan identity and the interaction between them. And what I think the figure shows the predicted support levels of regulating AI based on our index of the 3 different items. And what I think the figure show quite clearly is that respondents react differently to the information based on the source or the stakeholder that provide the information. And specifically, we see that Democrats reacted to information only when it came from experts, while Republicans reacted only to messages delivered by co-partisan elites, by Republicans. And this divergence in responses, you can see significant or important implications on the partisan divide in public opinion, on the polarization or the potential polarization of the public debate over AI. When Republicans politicians communicate their concern regarding AI potential risk, you see that the partisan divide over these issues is you see almost a convergence in preferences between Democrats and Republicans. So I think that overall this suggests that partisan divides on this issue is not fixed and can shift depending on the source or an effective communication with the information. I want to finalize with our behavioral outcome because we received some very interesting results. So you can see here the share of respondents who clicked on the invitation to visit the blog, the website, and so overall, we find that respondents randomly received the negative coverage treatments were significantly more likely to voluntarily enter to the weblog and or were interested to learn more about the risks that we just provide them only in the very short paragraphs. So we also find some significant variations depending on the source of the information, and specifically the highest levels of interest or visitations. We observed among respondents that received negative coverage from Republicans. And so I think that these evidence, we provide some suggestive evidence that the source of the information is not only influencing opinion directly, but also motivated more engagement or further engagement with, or curiosity with the information, substantive information and arguments regarding AI. So let me just conclude with some key takeaways and more general thoughts. That overall, we find that voters update their views when exposed to concrete information on AI risks, but not on benefits. We can talk about it later. But only in very specific conditions, they rely on elite cues to infer about the credibility or relevance or what information worth their attention. And just to know that, so as you can see, the experimental setting that we used a very clean and controlled setting that I think motivated respondents to engage with the information. And even in this very clean setting, we still see that respondents react to information or engage with the information in very specific particular conditions. And in most of the time, they dismiss the information, or the information was bring too little change in their preferences. That's it. Let's talk about the implications later. Thank you.
Alrighty. Thanks so much, Shir. Really enjoy this design. It's very neat. I have a simple question and then maybe a data source opportunity. So the quick question is, I'm imagining how individuals are responding to the different types of stakeholders. You have these very clean treatments where sort of tech leaders say X, or experts from academic experts say X. But we might imagine that they have members of the public associate partisanship with tech leaders and experts. And this is something we may know from the literature, what they're imagining and who they trust. But I was wondering just sort of your thoughts on that, and if there's any way in your data or in the future of getting at that, like asking, why do you think tech leaders are reliable, or who do you think of? Are they thinking of Elon Musk or Sam Altman? So it'd just be interesting to see how much partisanship might be a little part of that story also. And then sort of a data source possible opportunity. We have a couple papers asking similar questions about which stakeholders you would trust, and kind of your three big trade-offs: innovation, precaution, timing, and self-regulation, with state legislators, computing experts, and members of the public. So they're not exactly the same questions as yours, but potentially it could give you some cool baselines to compare between different samples. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so this is really interesting, and really enjoyed the presentation. Very well explained, very clear. So I did miss the part about the content of the negative information that was being provided, and in particular, I was wondering if the content itself could have a partisan valence to it to a certain degree. So, for instance, and again, I missed it, so I'm sorry. But if, for instance, if it was talking about potentially the impact of AI being a rise in inequality or bias or something along these lines, that it might be interpreted differently by different respondents depending on their own ideology or partisanship. And then so then what they're responding to is not only the co-partisan nature of the source of that information, but also the content of that information.
I have a question, if I can ask it. So actually I have three, but I'll try to merge them. I enjoyed your paper a lot. I think a few thoughts that I had were, one is that I was very surprised to hear the story about the media stories where Republicans were more likely to be positive about AI. That's counter to what I've seen. So I'm curious if it's mostly due to the low end. So it's basically of politicians speaking about it. Like I feel like there's probably, it's still not very much talked about, and that might be a result of that. And that also leads me to my other surprise, which was your finding of Republicans being, in a way, less supportive of regulation, which is somewhat counter to what we find, which is Republicans seem to be a little bit more cautious about AI in our surveys. And I wonder if it's just the fact that you use the word regulation and that just triggers something in them, regardless of, And this leads me to my third question, which is actually both for you and for Aina, and because it made me think a lot, both of your papers, and then later I think Victor's paper is well connected. One thing that I think emerges, I think this is a very important question of how people feel about government regulation of AI. But I think one thing that I seem to get from both of your papers was that we assume that there's a trade-off between regulation and economic progress. And I don't think that that's necessarily true, in the sense that, especially in the US, if we think about antitrust law, it's supposed to exist to increase consumer welfare, which is going to lead to lower prices and more economic growth and more innovation. So I don't think that regulation has to be thought necessarily as stopping innovation or economic growth. And that leads me to my next point, which is in the future, I think, what are people's mental models of regulation? What do they think regulation is doing versus what regulation actually does? And so, yeah, we should maybe write a paper in the future together about that.
Thanks, Beatrice. Maybe you can hold off on the answer until we all get back to a panel discussion, but go ahead.
Okay, so I'll start with the last question. So the way that we try to disentangle or differentiate between preferences or attitudes toward AI's risks and benefits or the AI's implications and preferences on the question of regulating this technology. And I think that when you ask the policy questions of how to govern this technology involves more broader questions about government role in the market and some attitudes toward tech industry in general. But I do think that we need to do a better work to differentiate between these two concepts. Daniel, thank you for these suggestions. I'm just a bit confused with all my points. Thank you for this suggestion. Do you want to return?
So one of them is just data sources, which is just discussion. The other one was
experts.
price and valence of the other stakeholders and how much that matters if there's a way to get at it.
Yeah, so in the paper we started to, I think that it's a discussion that it was to put on it more effort, but we discussed about the potential of polarizations based on the source of information. So respondents can engage with motivated reasoning, but they can be motivated by accuracy, but the way that they perceive the source of the information could be polarized. So you can see it also among populist voters that are more skeptical about experts, but it doesn't necessarily means that they are less motivated in the truth or seeking the truth compared to Democrats, for example, or Democrat voters or liberal voters that put more weight on experts' messages. I don't know, it's not answer your question. Okay. And with respect to the question about what are the key issues that resonate most with voters or respondents, so we do ask, I just mentioned it very briefly, but we added a follow-up task in which we ask respondents to rate the key issues, the 3 issues that they just received, and we assess the differences, whether there are significant differences between, first, the type of coverage and the source of information in the way that they rank the issues, but also as function of the partisan affiliation, respondents' partisan ID. And what we found is that we found significant differences between the type as a function of the type of coverage, so, but not as a function of the partisan ID. We still need to think what are the implications of these differences.
But specifically the risks that you present as the treatment, is it like an omnibus type thing where you have multiple risks, or?
So we presented the risk in 3 different domains. So AI in automation labor market, so the adverse effects, long-term effects on job displacements and employment, the consequences, negative consequences of using LLMs on manipulation of public opinion and spread of misinformation. So for each different domain, what we found consistently among all respondents, and it also was very consistent with the traffic engagement within the blog, which is that the issue that respondents or voters were interested the least was using AI in decision making, in public policy decision, which was a bit surprising for me. Yeah, but there is a lot of things that we need to try to understand on what are the key issues that we want to focus on in this paper, because there are too many. I think now it's a very early project, so there are too many things now that are happening.
Thank you, Shir. We could get back Aina and Yotam back here so we can continue with the panel conversation. And Aina, I don't know if you want to begin by responding to Beatrice's question maybe about regulation and positive effects of AI.
I don't have a response, but I take up your offer to try to think about this together.
Okay.
Great.
Can I start by asking my question again?
Oh, right.
Okay, to the panel, right? Which is like I'd really like to know, do you think it's dangerous that policymakers are going to get out ahead of the public? And I'm asking this not just in an academic way, because it could very well happen here in California. Because SB 1047 is on Governor Newsom's desk now, and he's going to sign it or not sign it in the next 2 weeks. And it could mean that in California, we're going to be way out ahead of the rest of the country in terms of regulating AI, in particular LLMs. Is that good or bad? Yes or no? How many say yes?
In one word, good. In 2 words, not good.
Exactly. Okay.
Okay.
Well, do you guys want to respond first before we collect more questions?
Can I ask a follow-up question?
It's good in the...
Okay, wait, okay, Bao, jump in.
Oh, no. So one thing I've been thinking a lot about is sort of the type of regulation that your studies are asking about, and sort of the focus of SB 1047, which is on, it's almost this sort of it's like a securitization angle, because a lot of the concerns are about catastrophic risks, like cyber attacks that can disable the power grid, or people using LLMs to create a more, like a bioweapon. Because the concerns, where the sort of bill originated from, is from the existential risk community that is very scared about AI causing human extinction. That's worst case scenario. Catastrophic risk, less worst scenario. So I wonder if there's certainly a lot of people saying that we're getting ahead with focusing on that because it's maybe a more far-off risk, but it seems like the legislations that you're considering is maybe more focused on sort of welfare policies or protecting human rights or civil rights of the public. So
okay.
that's
Let's address those 2 questions and then we'll open it back up.
Yeah, on whether it's good or bad that there's legislation without public support, no? So I think on one hand it's good because like we need some rules on important topics, and I think in part it's a reaction to what happened to social media, that maybe it came too late. And so like correcting a bit on that, it's I think, but generally, it's not good from a classical democratic perspective. But also, this topic is so complicated that I'm a bit skeptical that we can have a super enlightened debate and the different groups and like the whole political system will not be rearranged on this issue. So yeah, maybe to limit some harms, doing some sensitive and sensible regulations. It's
So my take would be that to Michael's question, I think that there clearly is pressure on policymakers to make certain decisions now because those technologies are being introduced. You know, police department can now decide that they're doing a big contract and getting those algorithms to actually make important decisions on key functions of how they operate. And part of, as I said, also the motivation is I think that now they're realizing more and more that because they're being forced to make, or sort of those tools are there and that they need to make the decision on whether to use them or not, that they want some backing by knowledge of what the public wants or some sense of where they're going to get into trouble, okay? And the idea that they're making those decisions behind people's backs and then it comes to light that those systems were actually important in making those decisions is a real problem for them. So part of what I think also the quote that we had from the Biden administration is that they really want now, okay, let's bring in the public in some way that will give us both an indication of where people stand, but also some coverage later when we know that, that those processes were decided in a way that wasn't just politicians in a back room, but also in some kind of process that involved the public. So I think it's a good thing that they're now concerned about this issue, that it can't be completely disaligned from what the public wants. I think that there are real questions in terms of what it would mean now to bring in the public and how it's going to operate. And what part of what we try to do here is trying to think of what public attitudes would mean, how they change. Is it something that we can actually use in a meaningful way? I don't think that we have strong, final answers here, but I think we're beginning to get more and more insight on that. So I think it's good that they're seeing the pressure. I think it's good that they're now trying to go in that direction. How well that is now going to translate into meaningful or beneficial policies is a real question.
Shir? Good. Okay. Helen.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing these really excellent presentations. I have a question for Ina and then one for Shir. So Ina, as I was listening to your presentation, I wrote down, that I was inspired by the movement that we saw by many of these frames to think about the fact that people's attitudes may be really malleable given the newness of the technology, the newness of the impacts, and also potentially the newness of the policies or, the outcome questions that you're asking about. And I think that Shir and Yotam's presentations, get at that, right? So I was wondering if you could do a little bit more to investigate how malleable people's preferences are in this area relative to other areas. I think this gets a little bit to Stephen's point earlier too. So do you see any difference in policies that represent more longstanding approaches to technological change versus things that might be newer proposals, such as like UBI, just to give one example? Do you see differences in other similar types of primings for policy areas that are more well established? And then also, do you see any differences based on people's self-reported prior exposure or experience with AI or prior knowledge of the AI policy space? So that's my ideas there. And then for Shir, when we often see these, conversations put out through the media about positive or negative aspects about AI, they're often also accompanied by proposals for policy action, right? So I was wondering if, I didn't get a chance to read through the full treatment, but if that's included as well, and if not, that could be an even stronger signal provided by these primings, right? There's a lot of research that shows that it can be difficult for people to take in new information and for that to affect their policy preferences. So the fact that both of your papers are finding that is actually pretty amazing, and I think that it's probably likely due to the malleability of people's preferences at this time. But if you did this again and you attach some associated policy proposals as well, would we see perhaps greater influence by some of those other stakeholders for specific policy preferences?
We'll collect a few more. Jim, go ahead.
Actually, I have a quick question. Go with that one first.
Okay. Well, I wanted to collect a couple more because we've got only
Well,
5 minutes.
okay, I'll ask mine real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if we look at SB 1047, which isn't just California because it really affects the whole country, the way that it's structured, but do you see that as public input or backroom input into policymaking? And you made a differentiation between that, so I'm just kind of curious, would you perceive that as public getting ahead of it or policymakers in backroom situations?
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Last one.
Sorry, just very briefly, fantastic set of papers. Kind of following up on Michael's question. So how I understood Yotam's and Shir's presentation, we don't have polarization yet, but we're sort of starting to get there, starting to emerge. At the same time, people kind of follow elite cues. And so from a practical perspective, shouldn't, here in the scientific community, shouldn't we put a lot of effort in reaching out to Republican lawmakers then? Because the Democrats already listen to the experts. The Republicans really listen to Republican politicians. So to reach the second half of the population, I think the way would be to kind of jump across the divide and engage with those lawmakers and see if there's something that we can do. And I guess this is something that is relevant for everyone here, if we want to actually have an impact on how regulation plays out in the end.
Great, thank you. Okay, in the 3 remaining minutes, please go ahead.
I'd like, I think on how malleable I think it's right now attitudes are structured around I'm an optimist or I'm a pessimist, no? And we need more like information, but also yes, attitudes are very malleable, but it like if you look at the type of arguments and other research we've done, so if you give people information about existential risks or so, like attitudes jump a lot around. But it's important that in public debate and also as a research agenda that we can go back to rational, so more specific arguments, no? Things that are reasonable, not like in the end of the world, but that like could happen in the next couple of years, what's it's for normal people and so on. And that, I think, it's what could help structure attitudes and the debate in a way that is helpful. And it's not about AI will destroy the world or save humanity. No?
Just to continue your input, at least from the follow-up study that I just presented, I think that one of the key takeaways is that the attitudes are not so flexible or malleable, and in very specific situations we found that people changed their mind or were willing to change their preferences. But the exact same information or concrete risks has little effect on voters' preferences when it comes from different specific stakeholders. So,
yeah, no, so I would agree with that. So I think one big takeaway from the combination of these studies is that clearly information does matter, but that it matters in ways that we can't just say any exposure to information is going to have an impact. And I think that you're right in suspecting that some sources of information are going to be more influential and ultimately going to be the focus of where the influence is going to come from, and where I think resources are going to be diverted towards having those sources be present out there and supporting the views that interested parties will want. And so whether it's Republicans, or I think there's a Daniel suggestion, whether, how should we think about tech leaders and how politicized are their stances, that's a real question that I think Shir's study is going to give us more information about, but that's a direction that we should think about. But I think, at least for me, it wasn't my prior to begin with. Like, I thought that this issue of people have strong stances that are pretty kind of gut feelings about whether new technologies, novel technologies are something that we should be incorporating or not. They're going to be quite influential, and the information is going to be quite difficult to actually incorporate and have a meaningful impact. I was surprised, somewhat encouraged to see that it can have this impact, but I think that the direction that Shir and Tamar are pushing is really important in sort of giving us much better sense of how it has this impact and the conditions under which the the speaker or sort of the source of the information matters. On your question, I have to think about it. I don't know enough about the case to give an informed view of sort of what exactly is the role of the public in leading or being followed, but I'll get back to you on that. That's a good question.
All right. Thank you. We've got exactly 540 seconds for a coffee break. That's 9 minutes. But first, join me in thanking the authors for the terrific papers.